I had always considered my room a sanctuary. The walls carried faint reminders of my childhood, old posters, half-peeled stickers, the scent of books I had read and reread on restless nights. It was the only space where I felt I belonged entirely to myself. Outside that door, life belonged to others, my mother, whose attention was consumed by her demanding job, and Daniel, my stepfather, who moved through the house with a presence that was difficult to ignore. When Daniel married my mother, I was cautious. He wasn't unkind, not in the least, but he was deliberate in every gesture, careful with every word, like a man rehearsing a role. His smile reached his lips but rarely his eyes. Still, he treated me with a kind of patience my mother didn't often extend. He asked about my day, remembered the names of friends I no longer spoke to, and offered help when I pretended I didn't need it. The dynamics at home were simple. My mother drifted in and out, her energy spread thin between work, errands, and the rare moments of family dinners where silence often filled more space than conversation. Daniel filled those gaps with ease, making himself available, stepping in where she had stepped back. At first, I welcomed it. His concern felt comforting, even grounding. But over time, that comfort grew into something I didn't want to name. It began in the smallest of ways. A hand on my shoulder that lingered a second too long. A compliment that brushed against something deeper than politeness. His gaze would hold mine during conversations, and in that pause, I felt both seen and unsettled. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was inventing tension where there was none. Yet the more I tried to dismiss it, the more present it became. Evenings became the hardest to bear. The house would quiet down, my mother tucked away in her room, and Daniel and I would sometimes cross paths in the living room. The flicker of the television cast shifting shadows, and our words would tread the fine line between casual and intimate. He laughed at things no one else noticed, listened to me with an attentiveness that left me disarmed. Beneath it all lay an unspoken truth neither of us dared to acknowledge aloud. I remember one evening in particular. I had been lying on the couch, half asleep, when Daniel entered. He didn't say much, just asked if I was comfortable, but the softness of his tone left me restless. When he adjusted the blanket over me, his fingers brushed against my arm. That accidental touch set my heart racing in a way I couldn't explain, and in that moment, I realized the boundary between us was no longer as clear as it once was. By the time that night arrived, the night everything changed, I was already caught in the web of my own conflicted feelings. I had tried to convince myself that I could control them, that nothing would come of the tension simmering between us. But desire has a way of seeping through even the strongest defenses. I went to bed earlier than usual, hoping sleep would quiet the noise in my head. My room was dim, the curtains pulled shut, the air heavy with the stillness of late night. I tossed and turned, my body restless though my mind begged for rest. And then I heard it, the soft creak of the hallway floorboards. At first, I thought it was my mother. But when the door to my room opened, I saw Daniel's silhouette against the faint light from the corridor. He stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether to step inside. My breath caught, and I pressed my eyes shut, feigning sleep. The sound of his footsteps grew closer until I felt the shift of weight on my mattress. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The warmth of his body beside me said enough. My pulse hammered in my chest, every nerve alert to the closeness of him. I could hear his breathing, steady and deliberate, and the faint brush of fabric as he settled into place. I lay still, uncertain whether to move or to surrender to the moment. 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, about loyalty, about trust, about the consequences that might follow. Yet beneath the fear was a quiet, undeniable pull. That was the night everything shifted, and there was no going back. The morning after carried a silence that pressed against my chest. Sunlight seeped through the curtains, drawing pale lines across the floor. I stayed in bed longer than usual, pretending to be asleep, though my thoughts were far too restless to allow it. Daniel's presence from the night before lingered in my senses, the warmth of him beside me, the steady rhythm of his breath. It should have been easy to dismiss as a dream, yet the weight of it clung to me as though it had been branded into memory. When I finally walked into the kitchen, Daniel was already there. He stood by the counter, pouring coffee, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharper than usual. My mother sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, unaware of the current between us. When Daniel's gaze found mine, something unspoken passed between us. It lasted no more than a second, but it told me everything. He remembered, too. Breakfast was filled with ordinary sounds, the scrape of utensils, the hum of the refrigerator, my mother's occasional sigh. And yet, beneath the domestic normalcy, there was a thrill that made my pulse quicken. It was the exhilaration of knowing something forbidden, of carrying a secret no one else could see. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm I hadn't expected. Daniel and I became experts at subtlety. A brush of his hand against mine when we passed dishes at dinner. A quick glance across the room that lingered just a fraction too long. His voice, softer when directed at me, almost conspiratorial. These small gestures seemed harmless on the surface, but together they built a language only the two of us understood. Late evenings grew into dangerous rituals. Sometimes we found ourselves alone in the living room, the television playing in the background while conversation carried us into hours my mother rarely noticed. Daniel had a way of listening that disarmed me, as if every word I spoke mattered. He asked about my ambitions, about my fears, about the things I never voiced aloud. And when I answered, he didn't laugh or dismiss, he held those words gently, as though they deserved protection. With each conversation, the boundary between us dissolved further. I told myself that his attention filled the spaces my mother left empty, that it was innocent. But innocence became harder to claim when his hand brushed against mine and stayed there, or when his gaze lingered long enough for me to feel the heat rise in my face. There were moments of risk, too, times when the house seemed to conspire against us. Once, as we sat too close on the couch, my mother appeared suddenly in the doorway. We leapt apart, pretending to be engrossed in the movie playing on the screen. She didn't seem to notice, but my heart hammered wildly, the adrenaline sharp enough to leave me breathless. When she left, Daniel caught my eye, a half-smile tugging at his lips. The danger, it seemed, only bound us tighter. The secrecy gave the relationship a strange, intoxicating quality. Each encounter carried both guilt and desire, as if the two were inseparable. I told myself that we were careful, that no one would know, but deep down, I understood the truth: we were playing with fire. And still, I wanted more. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed, Daniel and I found ourselves in the kitchen, the glow of the refrigerator casting the only light. He leaned against the counter, his voice low, confessing that he often felt unseen in his marriage. "She doesn't notice me anymore," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the tiled floor. His honesty unsettled me. It wasn't just desire binding us together, it was loneliness, raw and unguarded, that I confessed to, that I felt invisible in my own home, as if my presence mattered only in passing. Saying it aloud made me feel both ashamed and relieved. Daniel nodded, and in that shared vulnerability, something solidified. We weren't just betraying someone else, we were clinging to each other to fill the hollow spaces inside us. From that night onward, his footsteps in the hallway no longer startled me. I found myself listening for them, waiting for the moment the door to my room would open. The secrecy, the danger, the intimacy, it all became part of a life I could no longer imagine resisting. And yet, as much as I surrendered to him, a voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings. We were threading a path that could only end in exposure or heartbreak. Still, I silenced that voice, choosing instead to revel in the closeness that both terrified and thrilled me. That I knew I should have stopped, but instead, I kept waiting for his footsteps every night. Suspicion has a way of creeping in quietly, slipping through the cracks of even the most carefully guarded secrets. At first, it was subtle. My mother began pausing longer before speaking, her eyes darting between Daniel and me as though catching fragments of something she couldn't name. She grew sharper with her questions, about where I had been, about why Daniel seemed to spend so much time in my room, about the strange silences that hung in the air whenever she entered unexpectedly. For the first time, the house that had felt like a cocoon now pressed in on me, suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every sudden knock on the door, sent my heart racing. Daniel, usually composed, began to show cracks in his calm. His smiles faltered, his voice occasionally strained. Yet, despite the risk, he still found his way to me. Each stolen moment felt heavier now, charged not just with desire but with dread. One evening, the tension nearly unraveled completely. My mother had gone to bed early, or so we thought. Daniel had come into my room, his voice hushed as he whispered about his day, about the endless monotony of his marriage. We sat close, too close, when suddenly the door handle rattled. My mother's voice called my name through the wood, sharp and immediate. I scrambled to the other side of the bed, pretending to search for something on the floor. Daniel rose swiftly, clearing his throat as though nothing were amiss. By the time she opened the door, we looked ordinary enough, two people caught in casual conversation, but I could see it in her eyes, doubt. She didn't speak it aloud, yet it lingered in the room even after she left, her footsteps echoing down the hall like an accusation. When the door closed again, I felt the blood drain from my face. Daniel's hand found mine in the dark, his grip firm but trembling. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered. His words were meant to end things, but the way he held on to me betrayed him. Neither of us wanted to let go. After that night, something shifted. The closeness between us became laced with unease. I began questioning myself in ways I hadn't before. Was this truly love, or had I confused attention for affection? Was Daniel's touch about me, or about the emptiness he carried in his marriage? The answers blurred each time he looked at me with that same intensity. Each time I caught myself longing for his footsteps in the hallway, the weight of betrayal grew harder to ignore. My mother's laughter, when it came, felt like an indictment. Her trust was fragile, and though she didn't voice her suspicions outright, I carried the guilt of breaking something she hadn't yet realized was shattered. Nights with Daniel became bittersweet, filled with tenderness, yes, but also with a shadow of regret that I often lay awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, imagining the fallout if the truth were to surface. I pictured the fury in my mother's face, the devastation in her voice, the fracture it would leave in our family. The secrecy that once felt intoxicating now tasted bitter, like a sweetness turned sour in my mouth. Daniel, too, grew distant at times, though he never fully withdrew. There were moments when he would look at me as though searching for an answer he couldn't find. Once, he told me, "You make me feel alive again." His voice cracked when he said it, and for a moment, I almost believed that was enough. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't. Love built on betrayal cannot last without collapse. Still, I couldn't walk away. Every time I told myself it was the last night, that I would reclaim the solitude of my room, the sound of his approach undid me. I would surrender again, helpless against the pull of what we had created. Now, looking back, I realize we were not just breaking rules, we were rewriting them in ways that could never be undone. Desire had led us here, into a labyrinth with no clear exit. And though I feared the ending, I couldn't stop moving deeper into it. That it wasn't just infidelity, it was the moment I understood that desire refuses to follow rules. It makes its own, and in doing so, it remakes you.